All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session at 2020 Kids on communicating effectively about race. My name is Fawn Pattison, and I lead communications here at NC Child, so y'all know I'm excited about this workshop. And I'm going to introduce our presenter in just a moment. But before I do, I have some housekeeping. I apologize if you've already heard this many times before, but want to make sure everybody has good instructions. This session is completely bilingual in English and Spanish. We have a live interpreter on the line. Good morning, Mercado. Thank you for your work. Everyone will need to choose either the English or Spanish channel to hear the audio. If you don't choose an audio channel, you will not be able to hear the presenters. So to choose a channel, look for the little globe at the bottom right side of your Zoom screen and click that globe icon and choose either English or Spanish. If you choose the Spanish channel, you can hear the interpreter speaking in Spanish. You'll also be able to hear the English language presenter in the background quietly. If you don't want to hear that English in the background, you can just click the globe again and choose mute original audio, and you won't hear the English at all. Presenters, this is for us. We need to speak slowly and clearly so that the interpreters can keep up with us. And for everybody, we have a lot of participants in this webinar, so we're going to keep it on mute for all participants to have good audio quality. If you want to ask the presenters a question at any time during this workshop, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. That will help me keep track of our questions, but you can also use the chat box to share comments and links and anything else that you want to. When the presentation is over, we may have time for some more question and answer, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can, but we do have a lot of folks here today, so we may not get to every question. I apologize for that. Finally, this session is being recorded. The video will be available over the next week or two, both in English and in Spanish, and you will get an email from Lamine Perkins when all the recorded sessions are available. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Elaine Mejia is the Senior Communications Specialist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and she has been at CBPP since 2016, but y'all may remember her from before that when she served as the Director of the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, and we are also very honored to have Elaine serving on our Board of Directors here at NC Child. So y'all give a big digital round of applause. Thank you, Elaine, for being with us today. Excited about your presentation.
Thank you, Fawn. How is my audio? Just to double check. Okay, great. That feels like a big win, given that a hurricane went right over my little town in eastern North Carolina yesterday morning, but I know I'm not alone in that. Well, I'm just really thrilled to be here, and I hope you all are having a fantastic event. It sounds definitely like you have been. And I'm thankful to the people organizing the event for wanting to have this particular conversation, because for about it was really about 10 years ago that I actually did leave the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, and it was particularly because I wanted to focus on the role of narrative, right, and the quality of public debate and how much it drives the extent to which we, including you all, are really able to push for the kind of the big, deep, at the root, structural, upstream kinds of policy solutions and wins that we're trying to achieve over time. And I thoroughly enjoyed that work. And for about the last 5 years of that work, I've had a real focus on the role that race plays in shaping the public debate on all of the issues that we work on, and advising a network of organizations around the country that advocate for a whole range of policies, from Medicaid expansion, way to go Missouri yesterday, to progressive revenues that provide for adequately funded schools and healthcare and so many important community investments, to higher minimum wages and a very strong safety net and all kinds of things. And so I really advise that network of organizations on how to communicate effectively about their issues. And we, as a network, have really strengthened our focus on race, and I've been for several years had a focus on that. And I'm glad to have this moment to share with all of you kind of what I feel like are the themes and the important recommendations to keep in mind. And I'm also glad to say how far the the messaging and polling and framing and narrative research field has come in recent years from where it was several years ago, where it was still stuck in the default movement space around sort of this notion of color blindness, which was never really a thing, and driven by fears about communicating about race, into really pushing to say, no, if we're going to really get at the roots of things and build towards those bigger policy wins that we all want to see, then having a real focus on how do we hone our own public voice on race, and do that in bigger and bolder different ways than we ever have, right? How do we actually know what messages and narratives are actually highly motivating and feel really genuine to voters of color, residents of color, and communities of color in our state and our communities? What can we really do with our public voice to dismantle the stereotypes that get in the way and are a huge barrier to building broader support for public solutions? And so those are the kind of goals we have in mind with this kind of conversation. And I also think that the narrative and messaging and framing research, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, has come a long way to giving us those answers. And a lot of those answers come from community, right? Come from social movements who then those messaging and narratives experts can see the impacts of those movements, those very race-forward, race-explicit movements happening in our world and our communities, and then that can drive better messaging and communications guidance and research. So I just wanted to say, I think we're in a much better place, I think, to see both how important this is, and also have the resources to really be able to do it much more effectively than ever. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully this will go smoothly. Did that work, Fawn?
Yep, looks good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to actually start out with a chat, because I've just been talking to you about the kind of what we can all learn from the research field around framing, messaging, narrative, polling, but it's actually much more important as individuals and organizations to really stay grounded in what this bigger purpose is, and our values, right? Our shared values. So I actually want to start off with folks using the chat function to think about what are the kinds of things you would say to complete this sentence, right? I intend that my organization's communications with and about communities of color will be, and take a moment to just think about that and to use the chat, and feel free to put in multiple answers. Don't just feel like you can put just one. And we want to capture some of that here while we're together. Because actually staying grounded in our values and the way we want to do this work is even more important than trying to adhere to some messaging research that's out there, right? So thank you all. I see you're already really actively sharing, and these are wonderful responses. We want to be honest, right? Respectful, deliberate, consistent, intentional. Yes, thank you. Empowering, engaging, more respectful, progressive. Thank you for that point, Yolanda. I think a lot about how far afield our messages can go when we really have in mind a hardened opposition as an audience, and how important it is to think about messages that are really true to our values. So, right, we're here for everyone. Thank you. Respectful, effective, inclusive. Thank you. Powerful and earnest. Assets-based. Thank you. Valerie's been spending some time thinking about narrative. I can't say strengths and asset-based, which I will come back to, instead of sort of supposed weaknesses and deficits-based. Thank you, Valerie. Open-minded, active listening. Absolutely, that's an essential point, right? So our organization's deep partnerships with the leaders and advocates and experts that are working most deeply and intentionally in communities of color and on issues of racial justice, and building our communications and narratives based on that active listening and kind of true partnership should absolutely be, how we then ground and build our narrative and our public voice from there. These are wonderful. I hope someone's saving the chat as part of this, because this will be a great thing to collect and even do some Wordle out of or something like that.
Yeah, we are sharing it, so thank you. I love the word cloud idea. These
are great, everyone. Anti-racist, absolutely. Thank you. Be actually very intentional about taking down coded and what is typically coded but very highly racist narratives that are harmful and really getting in the way to building support towards policy solutions. So many great things here, folks. Welcoming, strengths-based, more inclusion. Yeah, thank you for the point too. I see Tasha with the point about evolving, right? We should always be evolving and learning, both from those relationships and partnerships that I talked about earlier, as well as from the messaging research at the same time. And if we were to all have set in stone our messages from 5 years ago, we would certainly be missing out on a lot of really important wisdom. Thank you for these. These are really great. So I just want to say that, so as I turn now to the bulk of what I'm here to talk about, which is what do I think we actually can learn from the themes of the recommendations of what I have found to be a growing body of very thoughtful work and how to communicate effectively about race and policy. It's even more important to stay grounded in these goals. And anytime messaging research or polling comes at you and looks tempting, but if we should always have this screen for, does it violate all these principles and our deeper values-based goals for how we really truly want to be inclusive and transformational organizations. Anytime the messaging research comes that feels like it violates those things, these values, these bigger goals that you just named are really what should drive our decisions. Because there are a lot of instances on that, and I've been pleased to see a growing number of organizations where messaging research comes at them and they say, no, actually you don't realize, messaging expert or researcher, that this particular message, when we sat down and actually talked in a community which experiences the most harm, it was actually, not empowering at all. And in fact, it was sort of otherizing or harmful or reinforced something that's not helpful. And that actually happens quite a bit. And then collectively, then we get to then inform and shape the messaging and narrative world and move it in a better direction. So these are just so important. So thank you all for sharing these. I look forward to collecting these from Fawn and the team and looking back at them. But this is exactly what I was hoping to collect. So these, informed by lived experience, I see is one of the last ones put in here. So important. So thank you. Let's stay grounded in these, even as you're making narrative decisions that are presumably also informed by messaging research. You do not have to spend much time at all with the deeper research on what shapes the debate about the issues we work on to know that even when race is not being named, it's frequently the biggest driver of the public debate. A colleague that I follow very closely, Ann Price from the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, has published some really interesting articles in the last 6 months about particularly the role of anti-Blackness. And when you look at narratives that drive debates about public policy and government, the role of government in America, if you dig pretty deep, you almost always find at the root of that is sort of this inherent thing that's baked in a bit to our DNA, right, which we're trying to extract, particularly in this moment where we're having a national conversation that's much more explicit. But it's just deep anti-Blackness. And what comes from that, right, is a whole set of very harmful beliefs that not only are not true, but they reinforce stereotypes. They're really the deeper block towards setting up a public conversation and a public narrative that actually can drive towards bigger, non-incremental, really important changes, and more importantly, changes that actually center and do the biggest amount of good for the people who have and are experiencing the most harm. So it's definitely just worth spending some time thinking about how anytime some deeper narrative research in recent years has really gone below the surface, they always find that really what's at the heart of it is race. And so in America, it's not only the case that race is definitely the biggest determinant of outcome, determinants and opportunities, but also it's the biggest driver of our public conversation about these things we work on. So what do we do? Well, I'm going to talk to you about two categories of things. First, I'm going to tell you what I think are some important things that come out of recent good research that are ineffective ways to communicate, or ways that progressives may inadvertently communicate in ways that reinforce harm. So let me walk through a short list of those. One thing to think about is don't only talk about race and people of color, communities of color when you're talking about the problem, right? That inadvertently can have the effect of actually making communities of color seem like the problem, right? So think also about talking about race when you're talking about your vision, right? Really, what could be, right, if we were actually investing in communities and taking down barriers that communities face? What could things look like? So think about also talking about people of color when you're talking about your vision and your goals, and also when you're talking about solutions, right? How will solutions affect and impact different racial and ethnic groups? So not only when you're talking about the problem. It's important to consistently look through our own messaging and narratives to make sure that we are not using otherizing language or using harmful frames that reinforce unhelpful things or accidentally reinforce stereotypes. Things you very commonly see are things that sort of imply kind of collective, group-wide weakness, right? That don't actually then reveal the structural reasons why. So just blanket terms like vulnerable or disadvantaged, right? Or even minorities, continuing to sort of map out what are all these terms and moving beyond them, or at least when we're using them, always pairing them with a little bit of structural explanation. So if you're using a term like vulnerable or disadvantaged, you're always pairing it with a little bit of language about what you mean. Otherwise, you're labeling an entire group, right, as somehow inherently different, somehow inherently weak, and inadvertently reinforcing harmful narratives. You know, it's for a long time it has been the default metaphor to talk about gaps as a way to talk about racial disparities. And it turns out from the research that that's actually not the narrative or the frame that is most helpful to us as communicators. So first of all, I mean, the biggest problem with it is a gap is actually a very neutral term, and it doesn't imply a harm, right? There's a gap between me and my colleague Fawn across the screen here right now, but neither one of us is being harmed by that. It also, if you think about it in that way, you can also realize that a gap also creates a sense of disconnectedness, like there are folks over here and there are folks over there, and works against one of the fundamental things we need to do as communicators, which is to consistently be helping to show the interconnectedness between communities, right, and a sense of shared fates. So that's really important. So it's not that you can't ever use the term gap, but if you feel really reliant and dependent on that metaphor in general, I would spend some time, yourself and your colleagues, thinking about, well, how can we talk about what we really mean when we say gap, and how can we move beyond that? And in a little while, I'll talk about, obviously I'll give you some proactive recommendations that give you some new options, but thinking about no longer relying on the gap metaphor, it doesn't get us nearly as much as we have in the past thought that it did in our communications. Don't put out just bare facts about race in which you're not packaging inside of values or goals or your vision. When you put out a bare fact about, that's just a bare statistic, you know, about a racial and ethnic group, you can actually inadvertently reinforce all of the reasons why someone who's reading or seeing that information, all of the reasons why they think that number is what it is. So it's important to always package them in at least a little bit of context, right? So instead of just, you know, this percentage of, you know, Black children in North Carolina are poor, it's more something like, you know, opportunity is, you know, still too out of reach for so many families. And then you've got your statistic about different racial and ethnic groups and how they're faring. So not just putting out bare facts. I'd also, you know, it's important to don't just reduce bad things. When we have our entire, and when you have race explicit narratives where your goal is positioned as just let's reduce bad things, reduce inequality, reduce poverty, reduce a gap, you know, eliminate a gap, reduce disparities, and you're talking about it in the context of race, you can again inadvertently be portraying communities of color and different racial and ethnic groups sort of as the problem or as the thing that you're trying to reduce. So if you go through your own communications, you find you're very dependent when you're talking about your goals of always having your goal as reducing a bad thing. Think about how you can flip to something more aspirational that's about the good things you're trying to build. It's really the exact same agenda, it's the exact same data, but it's what's your vision. So If you're, instead of just reducing inequality, are you trying to build equality? Are you trying to expand opportunity? Are you, right, trying to help more people thrive? Think about how you can take your agenda and your goals and reposition them from reducing bad things to building good things. Another thing to think about is not relying on competition-based metaphors when we're talking about different racial and ethnic groups and public policy. So, you know, when you're using language like, we need these things in place so this group of people can compete, or we need to level the playing field. There was, of course, a flare up in the public news a few weeks ago about somehow the skills gap needs a bunch of attention right now and is to blame for what's sort of going on nationally with our crashed economy. And of course, that plays right into the hands of this narrative that's about level the playing field and competition. And what it does is it inadvertently reinforces scarcity narratives, right? And that's not only demotivating, right, to marginalized communities and people closest to the harm, but just in general reinforces scarcity narratives and plays into the hands of our oppositions. So those are some highlights of some things to reconsider. If you're doing some of those things, relying on some of those things, and I certainly, in my past life as an advocate and a communicator, have done all of those things. But I'm just highlighting that research shows that, right, we need to cut back on these sort of habits as communicators and build from a different place. So let's switch from what the don'ts look like to thinking about, well, what the do's. But before we do that, this is the kind of thing that you see very often from advocates and activists that we would absolutely agree with them on the problem they're trying to bring attention to and their policy solutions, and yet they do this very much in a way that reinforces some harmful narratives. So why don't folks use the chat function right now, if you take a second to read this, and drop in what kind of harmful narratives or harmful ways of thinking or talking about issues you think may be reinforced by the language that we see in this tweet from or an organization and set of people that I feel sure we would be on the right side of, or be in sync with. Yeah, right, children are responsible for this. Definitely, right, youth of color are costing us money. Definitely, thank you. Absolutely reinforces notions of youth of color as criminals. Thank you. And in criminality out of proportion. Yeah, drain on resources, people of color costing taxpayers. It's actually a study that just came out recently, well, in the last 9 months, that actually really looked at how highly racialized even the term taxpayers is. So when you see it, be aware of that. And it's a common tactic of our opponents to use that term. And it doesn't mean we don't get to talk about taxpayers, but like one thing to consider doing is when you talk about taxpayers, being more race explicit, like taxpayers, whether Black or brown or white, or whether, you know, sort of, so considering bringing it out of a coded space. But it's interesting to see the research on how highly racialized the term taxpayer is. Right, so you all are seeing exactly, but yet you can imagine ways in which you could rework this. They start to get to some better, more aspirational language right here at the bottom. So you can imagine flipping this in a way that says, hey, new incoming legislature needs to make youth healing and opportunity the top priority. And then you can imagine also rewriting this data point so it doesn't reinforce the stereotypes, like students of color are, have the school resource officer called on them, you know, 4 times more often than white students for the same behavior, right, or something like that. And instead of how they're costing us billions of dollars, it's like, hey, we might have $1 billion more to reinvest in learning and an opportunity, right, if we didn't have this sort of racist practice or policy in place. You can see how you would begin to rework it if you were to move away from some of these don'ts that they're inadvertently practicing here in this tweet. Thanks for all your thoughtful comments in the chat, folks. So It won't surprise many of you to learn that it's just important to lead with and continue to return to core values. And values are highly motivational to our audiences. They tap into the deeper why. Why does this matter? And they also, help to answer the question for folks of even if at this given moment you're not relating to whatever particular policy solution or don't feel particularly affected by this issue, how you are actually connected to it. And values are very motivating, regardless of what type of audience that you're communicating with. I will say that as I dig through the research that's specific on how to talk about race and racial equity in the context of policy, some values really stand out from that research as being recommended more often. So these are examples of those, right? Potential, mobility, dignity, community, opportunity. Now, we don't only want to be people that are just throwing these words out all the time. We will end up sounding like, I don't know, a tourist location brochure or a Hallmark card version of policy advocates. But so it's really important to just know what these values are, and then to also take some time yourself and your respective teams and the people you're working with to actually create phrases that can cue up a sense of these values in your different audiences, and to build yourself a bit of a bank of those things. So when you're talking about opportunity, for example, a state where people aren't just getting by, but getting ahead. That's a way of talking about opportunity and of queuing up that value. Each child should receive the support they need to thrive, to reach their full potential. No matter where we come from, what we look like, North Carolinians work hard for their families. And so just create for yourself a bank of phrases that feel right to you, that fit to the kind of voice your organization is trying to have, and that cue up these values and a connection to these values in your audiences. The organizations I work with, as I said before, if you want to see a list of them, you can go to statepriorities.org, and there's a map and you can click on them. And of course, if you click on North Carolina, you'll find the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. But of course, have gotten much better over the last several years about staying grounded in values, and they've also become much more race forward in how they're communicating around a range of issues. So you see, this was a budget analysis that was basically, hey, how are people of color faring in our state budget decisions? But of course, they call the document Budgeting for Opportunity, and they also use the term here, shared prosperity. So very much a race explicit analysis and policy document, and it's really grounded in some of this values-based language I was talking about. I said before that one organization I follow very closely because I feel like they consistently model really excellent messaging, particularly when it comes to race forward materials, is the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. And this is just a sample of a narrative from one of their products that leads with the value of economic security and then comes back quickly to dignity and security. And I'll come back to in a minute why I also have the word fence underlined. That's an upcoming recommendation. My colleagues that I work with in Washington State are really a terrific organization to look for. Their race forward content is really terrific. And really it's throughout all of their policy issues that they work on. I've worked on them a lot with how they talk about TANF and other social safety net related programs and naming race in the context of those. So they've got some great values-based language here when they were talking about new census data. No matter who they are, where they live, we want people to have opportunities to thrive. So you're sort of setting it up with values and the bigger picture vision, and then coming in with, that's why this kind of focus on how Latinx and Black Washingtonians are doing, right? In this case, they're 2 to 3 times more likely than white counterparts to struggle to make ends meet. You can see how this is sort of the setup I was talking about earlier, leading with values, in this case, opportunity to thrive, and then coming in with your data about different racial and ethnic groups and how well is our state doing in terms of advancing these values for every community, each community, right, that lives here. When you talk about the problem, I just spilled my drink, but it was minor, so let's keep going. When we talk about the problem, it's important to describe the problem in terms of barriers. This gets at this sort of structural causes and also points towards structural solutions. It's also really, if I'm telling you that the reason a particular community isn't making gains relative to sort of a goal is because they encounter barriers, then the thing that I'm consistently implying to you is this fundamental truth that we need to continue to tell about different racial and ethnic groups in our state, right? Which is, it's not fundamentally a problem of lack of effort or of anything to do with character, right? So this is one of the ways in which we can get at some of the deepest, most harmful stereotypes that are getting in the way of a more productive understanding and a more truthful understanding, as we consistently talk about barriers and roadblocks and hurdles and things that portray the problem as fundamentally structural. And when we're portraying the problem as fundamentally structural, we're also then pointing to the need for structural solutions. People much more easily see the role of policy in undoing a barrier or a roadblock than they do think of a policy addressing a gap, right? So it also really puts your audience in a much better place to understand the role of policy solutions and how important those are, instead of where we know so many people's minds like to go, right? Like, well, it's such a big problem, it's insurmountable, right? The way you might think of a gap or a canyon. If you present an image that's sort of the Grand Canyon when you're talking about racial equity, people do not see what would we do about that. But when you're talking about barriers, they're structural, they're also, you know, man-made, person-made, made by policy, conveys a lot of important information about things, but even with the simple idea of a metaphor. So think about, as you're thinking to move on from gaps, really, how can you talk about barriers? And it's not only the metaphor of barriers, but it's also important to always give a few tangible examples of barriers where your audience could see, well, some people in audiences are in, you know, particularly close to harm might say, oh yeah, that's absolutely the things that are getting in our way. And other folks will see, yes, I can imagine if I was encountering that every day, that it would be hard to get ahead, right? It'd be hard to take care of my family. It would be hard to get health care, whatever it is that you're working on. Our colleagues in Arkansas, child advocacy organization I work with, put out a whole series of reports a few years ago that documented particularly the state of Black men and boys in Arkansas, and they grounded their entire report in the notion of barriers, breaking down barriers. And this is a way of basically saying this is structural, and hey, you know, look here, look inside of our document, our agenda for policy solutions. And they also definitely stayed grounded in values too, because you can see in their title, how can we begin expanding opportunity? And the first series in their report was about family economic security. So clearly family and economic security, you're very much staying in a values-based language space. So this is a neat example. The opportunity agenda is really, really worth spending some time with if you're communicating in race explicit ways about the work that you're doing. And I'm assuming you are if you're here. But so for example, the opportunity agenda, it's primarily a communications focused organizations. And just in the last couple of days, actually, they updated and published a new version of their big and very detailed guidance about how to communicate effectively about race and policy. If you go to just opportunityagenda.org right now, the top thing on their page is their big new updated guidance. And I rely on a lot of organizations, but I rely most heavily on the opportunity agenda, and I really can't recommend them highly enough as just a go-to place on a range of issues for how to communicate effectively about things. They not only commission original research themselves and very much have our goals and our values in mind, but they also have very in-depth knowledge of all of the other messaging research that's going on out there, and they incorporate it as well. So I highly recommend them. And this is a good example of them giving us language that models this idea of barriers, right? Because they give specific examples of barriers that children of color facing in classrooms, right? Overcrowded, uncertified teachers, excessive discipline. Now, depending on the issue you're working on, you'll need to identify specific barriers that match to that issue. But I really encourage you to come up with a few that you can use consistently in your materials and are ones that are that won't require an incredible amount of explanation unless you're particularly in a document or a moment where you have a captive audience for several thousand words or for an extended period of time. But typically it's a couple of 2 or 3 barriers written in a very accessible language that people can relate to. And I will say it's fine for your barriers to name race too. Like sometimes a barrier is just, continued evidence of hiring discrimination based on race or housing discrimination. But just, you get the idea. The concept of barriers and then naming a few of them in your communications is so important. And next, and this goes to something that some of you said in the comments earlier when we were talking about staying grounded in our bigger values-based goals, we think about making communications and messaging decisions in our work, which is to present disparities primarily through a contribution model and not through a deficit-based model. Sometimes it's also called an asset-based model, because it's been the default, I think, in progressive movement for a very long time to really want to talk about different racial and ethnic groups in terms of what's not here, right? There's so much of this bad thing, whether it's a poverty rate or maybe even a persistence over policing or whatever it is, to only talk about things through a deficit base. How much bad stuff is here, and so this is thinking about how we flip to, which is very much using the same data and being just as real about what the data is, but towards a more contribution-based model. So it's from how much is not here to how much could be here, right? If we made better policy choices. This is much more motivating actually to, in the research shows, to voters of color and residents of color themselves. People do not, and people closest to the harm and in communities that are suffering the most also don't like to consistently hear about how bad things are, right? Doesn't mean we don't need to present that data and be genuine about it is, but when you present it in terms of here's how much could be here if we made better investments, better policy decisions, it's the same data, but it's actually, it's much more motivational across the audiences that you might have in mind, including marginalized communities. So, for example, you might think about, as you're moving away from gap between health insurance coverage for Black and white North Carolinians to something like, hey, if we took steps to raise the health insurance rate of Black residents too, and right here I have written goal, because I do think it's worth thinking about whether or not you want to make sort of white the default goal. It has an inadvertent effect of sort of always putting whiteness as a sort of a default ideal that's on top. So in that way, I think it can be otherizing and not helpful. It doesn't mean we don't absolutely need, it's not helpful to give out the white data, it absolutely can be. But when you're staying in the gap frame, if you're only talking about how if we raise the rate of sort of in this example, rate of health insurance for Black residents to the white rate. So I would consider you to recommend to you that you think about in all of the different policies that you're working about, what is your goal? And it doesn't mean you then can't be explicit about, and hey, maybe the white number tells us kind of what's possible if we took down barriers and people had equal access to things, but that's not necessarily the same thing as talking about what's your goal. So you can see the shift here from an assets-based to a contribution-based narrative for how you're talking about things. Policy Link as an organization is one I also would really highlight as having very consistent, well-messaged, race-forward content. And they are also very good about positioning their content in this contribution way, right? So you can see an example here. Our nation is missing out on a wealth of cultural wisdom, innovation, skills, passion, energy, when 1/3 of our population remains relegated to the sidelines. We all stand to win when everyone's brought fully into the fold, right? The US is leaving $2.5 trillion in economic activity on the table, right? So you get the sense of, here's how much we would have, right, if we actually had policies in place that was allowing everybody to contribute. And I also really love how when they're talking about the contributions here, even though this is sort of an economic story, they're not staying only in only an economy story. They're talking about a broader range of contributions people can make. That's not just about dollars and cents. So Policy Link, I also would recommend to you as a model organization to go to and check them out and see their race explicit content. It's generally very well messaged. Include broader community impacts. So it is certainly important to focus on, as I said earlier, really exactly how our solutions would benefit different racial and ethnic groups, but it's also important to include examples of broader positive ripple effects in the community. We all just know this to be true. When we design solutions or prioritize solutions that will do the most good on racial equity and will do the most good for different racial and ethnic groups, there are almost always broader ripple effects in terms of how this strengthens communities overall, how this makes things just better in general. And it is helpful in your messages and narratives to include examples of that. This is from our colleagues in New Mexico, as a sort of counterpart organization to NC Child out there, New Mexico Voices for Children. They were using, this is talking about kids in schools. They clearly use the roadblock or barriers metaphor, but then they also followed it up with, hey, when we ensure that all children can reach their potential, we all benefit. This is an example from our colleagues that I work with closely in West Virginia, talking about the need to continue to sort of shore up their implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And you can see right here in the middle of their opening narrative, they have making sure people have access to quality, affordable healthcare builds stronger, healthier communities. So it's both about the people that really most need healthcare right now, but it's also consistently including at least a little bit language that points to, and that builds stronger, healthier communities overall. Our colleagues in Georgia that I work with closely have done a really great job and have grounded a lot of their campaign work in recent years in talking about the growing diversity in Georgia as a strength, and also pointing out that, hey, unless lawmakers are embracing that diverse future and working to ensure that all people are offered opportunities to thrive, the state's economy and state's community will fall short of their potential. So you have a lot of values-based language, and then also you're connecting the dots to how things get better for the community overall when we make better policy decisions. This is an example of a visual from our colleagues in Washington State that I work with closely. Again, I said I work very closely with them, particularly on social safety net related things. So this was a product about TANF. And I just think this is a visual example of both sort of clearly, literally centering a person of color here, but then also expanding it to clearly imply, that by enacting this policy improvement, that a number of different types of people in Washington stand to benefit. And lastly, or at least I think it's my last recommendation, offer solutions early and often. So it certainly is the default for our audiences to think of solutions as complicated, or as problems as complicated, as intractable, and also very much understandably to think of how difficult it will be to really get public lawmakers to really ever fully consider solutions. So offering solutions early and often is very motivating to a wide range of audiences. Again, it also helps to connect the dot. It also achieves the effect of not only talking about people of color and communities of color when we're talking about problems, but also when we're talking about solutions. And it's just really important to keep your audiences engaged, to offer solutions early and often in your communications. And sometimes that can feel awkward when you're used to kind of feeling like, well, I really feel like I need to much more fully explain the problem before I get to a solution. And from a messaging standpoint, don't do that. You can come back to a deeper explanation of the problem, but get to solutions early and often. It really keeps audiences engaged. It makes problems seem solvable and like we can really make progress. And when you're talking about race, that's even more important. Our colleagues in Kansas a few years ago, something about a major report that they put out. The thing that impressed me most was literally in the second sentence, they started naming specific policy solutions that they were looking for lawmakers to take up that would make a big difference for racial equity. And they had a lot of values-based language in the opening too, as you can see here about that, envisioning what it looks like when every Kansan is able to participate and fulfill their potential. And in this case, there was a report about children of color. You can also imply solutions just with the titles that you're giving products or titles that you're giving to events. So these respective documents include a lot of detail about the problem, but the opening of them really implies, hey, look here for solutions. So building opportunity, a toolkit for the future, building as well as toolkit, that implies, hey, solutions here, look inside for a plan. And then blueprint, right? Obviously signaling solutions right from the beginning of this communications. This is a flyer from an event that was all about racial wealth gaps. But I love that they had the biggest words literally on this page are 10 solutions, right? That's very engaging to our audiences, and is particularly what's needed when we're connecting the dots to race and having race forward messages. This is from our colleagues in Rhode Island, that they're talking about the latest census data in their state and what it means, and they're naming Rhode Islanders of color in particular. They use the barriers right up front. But then more importantly, in like the second sentence, they named the need to raise Rhode Island's minimum wage. So rather than leaving that way down to the bottom, they really had it right up front. So it's an example of what I meant about get to solutions early. So we talked about values, use a lot of everyday language like make ends meet and avoiding abstractions. Talked about the importance of the metaphor of barriers and moving beyond a sort of default of gaps, using both the metaphor as well as giving our audiences examples of tangible barriers that are holding communities back, moving away from a deficit-based portrayal when we're talking about different racial and ethnic groups and switching to a contribution-based model, including examples of community impacts and getting to solutions early and often. There are more recommendations out there, but these are the ones I feel like are themes across the research that's been done in recent years about how to communicate effectively about racial equity. So I hope these are ones that you'll keep in mind as you develop your own campaigns and materials and presentations and social media content and all of the amazing things and content and ideas that you all are putting out into the world. With whatever time left, I am very happy to entertain a few questions.
Thanks, Elaine. That was a great presentation, and you're getting lots of kudos in the chat box. So I hope that you're noticing those coming in. One thing I want to lift up is lots of people are asking about the slides. You had many, many great recommendations in those slides. I already had a copy as a PDF, so I went ahead and uploaded those. And the link is in the chat box right now. So if you want to grab that link, copy it, and just paste it into your browser, you'll be able to just download the slides right now if you want to. So that's something people can take away. And I think folks are really appreciate the information that you're sharing today.
Yeah, I'm going to drop another link, which is it's kind of a secret little place that lives online where I keep the research that I have thought that for me has been most informative. And people are welcome to go check that out. It's for those of you who actually kind of want to go deep and look at the back end and dig in, but I've just put that in here too. Don't share it widely. It's really for close allies, but you're welcome to go check it out. And I do update it periodically too, and I welcome some of you all to suggest things I can add to it. Making sure it's coming out to everybody. There you go.
Great. And I want to let folks know who are in the Spanish language channel. I don't have the slides in Spanish at this moment, but we will have them for you in about 2 weeks. So when we send a follow-up email, you're going to get those slides in Spanish as well. So trying to make sure that all this information is available. We do have a few minutes left, and I think one of the things that really lit a fire with folks, especially I think there was a comment from Julie Jones that I think really gets to the point. Like, this is how we work with families, right? We use a strengths-based frame, we use an asset-based frame, and I think once you think about it that way, it's a big aha, right? That people are motivated by understanding their own strengths and seeing things in a positive frame. So I just wonder if there's anything else we want to hit on with that, and one that I want to hit on with that is COVID-19, because we're in a really difficult time right now. It's a really dark time, and it's news to a lot of people still, shockingly, that COVID-19 is hitting communities of color harder than others, and it's really, I think some of that language is being weaponized against communities of color. So I'm interested in, Elaine, whether you have any tips about talking about COVID-19, talking about those disproportionate impacts, if you're seeing research about that.
Yes. And I actually, if there's a way fun for me to send you some additional resources where some communications firms and messaging researchers who I really think share our values and our goals have put out some really thoughtful things. And I'm glad to send you a list that people can access directly. But I do think these lessons are more important than ever right now, because it is very easy for our audiences to, well, you're definitely in a moment when audiences are both at a kind of extreme moment of alertness about things. But it's interesting. So with a lot of the groups that I work with, I noticed that a lot of the things that the groups are posting are the things that speak most directly to individual needs, which is both a blessing and a challenge. So a lot of our groups have been putting out tips or connecting people with, hey, here's how you actually apply for unemployment insurance right now. But which is great. So being organizations that are putting out those kinds of resources and using this moment to draw people into a bigger conversation about, you know, how can we actually have policies in place that don't mean that every recession, much less every pandemic, or whenever we do have a pandemic or a massive public health challenge, how can we put things in place that actually allow people and communities to be more resilient? And there's also a lot of interesting research about how when we mean well when we want to talk about how resilient different communities are, but it actually can have the same effect as really otherizing, because you're really obscuring the harm that people are going through. You're also kind of implying that somehow some communities are inherently different. Somehow this would be good for different communities. So caution people to think about how we're talking about resiliency, and it's more about, we should always only be talking about things like resiliency in terms of what we're trying to build, not trying to imply that it's something that exists. And it's always needs to be talked about as it's policy and public solutions that build that. And don't we want it to be that every community is resilient in terms of their economic situation as well as their personal, family, and community health. But it is very easy as communicators to slip into some defaults where we are, you know, there's a lot of research that shows how crisis-based narratives have the opposite reaction that you hope they would have in your audience's minds, right? You hope that it brings your audience to a place of, we all have to come together right now and do something. And actually it really has the effect of, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go lock myself in my house and take care of just myself and my family. So that's an important thing to keep in mind right now, because we are completely in a crisis, right? Many crises. And while at the same time, we've been going through this moment in which we've been also unveiling and revealing for example, the over-policing and the deadly harm of lack of reform of law enforcement. So being very careful about crisis-based narratives, where how can I have narratives that are very true to the impacts and the harms that are going right now, but never tip over into a crisis mode, because even for our most well-meaning audiences, they get sort of fatigued, and it also reinforces wow, I better go take care of me and mine. So always being mindful of how to strike that balance is so important, and being conscious of that right now more than ever is probably one thing to keep doing. But I also have been collecting a lot, some specific resources put out by progressive communication firms I trust the most, and I'm glad to get you those specific things that you can share with people afterwards.
That's great. And we do have a COVID-19 resource page on NC Child's website.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we'll add them there. Great idea.
Cool. So we're getting a few different questions that kind of in the same vein together with the idea of intersectionality and also breaking down silos. So we have a question or comment from Ginger around sort of that intersection between race and disability. There's a question from Diane about sort of silos in our work and building bridges between different policy areas related to racial equity. So she's giving the example of nutrition and food insecurity. And so I think maybe the broader question is kind of around, how do we make sure that we're using our language to build those bridges and not inadvertently, further silo some of these policy issues or different groups of people?
Yes, well, that's a great question. And I certainly agree that making these connections in our communications can only help. Because barriers, absolutely compound. I do think many of the lessons that we're learning from the messaging research that's been done specifically around race also feel very relevant, right? When you're talking about other marginalized groups and sort of marginalized identities. So I do think naming the intersectionality and portraying a more full picture can only help in our communication. So I fully support that. I will say that from a narrative standpoint, there's also a lot of, well, from a policy standpoint, I've been thinking a lot recently about how when we focus on the groups that in our communities, in our society that face the greatest number of barriers and have faced the most consistent and deepest oppression, when we focus on them, and those people often have multiple lines of, multiple lines of sort of identity and marginalized identities. When we focus on designing policy solutions that make the biggest difference for those folks, that is when we will not only land on and identify the policy solutions that will make the biggest difference for everyone overall, right? So, but it's also when we're focusing on them, when we're thinking about narratives, right? Narratives are not only true and genuine to their lived experience right now, but that also feel motivating to those folks. That is also when we will land on our most powerful narratives too. That will actually really get at the roots and allow us to build a public debate that opens up the possibility of much bigger structural solutions and not just sort of incremental changes. So, I mean, those are a few thoughts off the top of my head. It's a really great question.
Yeah, Elena, I think it may have been you who shared this example with me that I'm reminded of as we're having this conversation about a specific policy in city planning where advocates for folks who with limited mobility were advocating for ramps on sidewalks and ramps at intersections to make it easier for folks using mobility assistance to get onto sidewalks. And when those were implemented and through city planning processes, it actually really helped local businesses as well because their deliveries and moving things in and out became much easier for them as well. So just like an unintended consequence, I guess, that it actually helps everybody, right? When you set out to, to make design better, make policy better.
Yeah, there's so much research, right, about the Americans with Disabilities Act and all the ultimate ripple effects, right? And how focusing on this particularly group that faced that deep and persistent barriers that required lots of structural changes, right, to really actually allow people to live their full lives that we would want them to live, but then all of the ripple effects of how much better that made things overall. The other place for me in this space that has been compelling in recent years has been like around maternal health and a focus on Black moms, right? And how a focus on Black moms when we're thinking about solutions, both in terms internal to health systems as well as broader health policies. When you're designing policies that make the greatest difference there, when you implement them, they have the greatest difference, make the greatest difference for everyone in the health system. And it's just I don't know, something that when we focus on it, both in our policy analysis and our agendas, as well as in our narratives, that I think will set ourselves up for biggest wins.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Sharon, for dropping in a link to that curb cut effect example into the chat box. We just have time for maybe one more question, and I see a great one in the Q&A that I think is a great way to wrap this up. There's a question from Amy at a Frameworks presentation she attended. They talked about not really wanting to use the word racism specifically because it's too big and it frames the wrong schema, and from that perspective that she heard at this presentation. But when does the responsibility to name and address racism outweigh the idea of sort of effective communication or whatever, or strategic communication in that moment? And she was working on maternal health at the time, so I think that also helps frame this up. But
well, it absolutely is true that with all these thoughtful organizations with the incredible depth of expertise, like Frameworks, when we have and not just me, but all of us over time have commissioned them to sit down with folks and not hardened opposition folks, but people we imagine we might want to persuade, right? And they test out narratives. They do typically find, particularly that sort of opening with race or opening with racism isn't effective. And it is then very difficult to figure out, well, how do we grapple with that? So there's no great answer to that. There's also a lot of deeper kind of social movement research that points to when we have very race-forward movements in America, that's actually when we break open the biggest policy changes. So that research comes more from kind of the sociology space sort of than it does from the messaging research space. So I do think, I work with most of the organizations I work with are much bolder now, particularly in moments where we've got to stand in solidarity because, like, say a lawmaker has said something incredibly racist, right? So a group we work with actually in Alabama this week put out a statement because a lawmaker there had attended an event honoring an extremely bad actor in their racist history, So they put out a statement and called on that lawmaker to resign. Obviously, a lot of groups we work with have been putting out lots of consistent content lately, calling out the sort of embedded racism in law enforcement and criminal justice in the United States and how committed we are as a network and to big, bold solutions that really dig up and dismantle that racism inside those systems, that means rebuilding them from scratch. So there are certainly moments like that. So we are doing a lot more of that kind of thing. I say we, I'm really talking about sort of this network of state organizations I work with. But so I generally have as a recommendation not to kind of lead with racism, but I still think we have to figure out ways to set us up for a better conversation. I think the fact that when we ask these firms like Frameworks to sit down and actually talk to like potential voters we might want to persuade, the fact that they find, hey, it turned out naming racism early didn't make people want to raise this progressive tax for more, pre-K. That's one lesson that they're giving us, but I also think we can't stop there. Like, it's important to know that and to figure out what to do about that and what does that mean as we're thinking about how we communicate with different groups. But I also think it's equally important to recognize that when the nation gets out of a coded and so-called colorblind space, which never really was a thing, but I hope folks know what I mean by that, and we're in much more race-forward moments of social movement and social activism. That is also when we unleash the greatest changes. And also we release that, and also there's a lot of evidence that shows that's actually when we dig up and actually really reduce a lot of the racial anxiety and racist attitudes that are out there too, is because when we have these moments. And so, we just have to keep grappling with those two truths and figuring out what to do with them. So yeah, I have a lot more to say on that. And if that person wants to get in touch with me, we can talk.
I think that's great. I think for me, one of the things that raises too is, going back to your point about naming specific barriers, right? And that racism as a broad, scary thing is not necessarily the barrier in a specific situation. The specific situation is this racist policy, this policy that is impacting Black children differently than other children, whatever. So I think being more specific without shying away from talking about race, but stepping into that, I think is.
Yeah, racist policy, talking about racist policies and naming policies as racist, I think is definitely something to consider in this space and this particular conversation we're just having. I'm glad you brought that up.
I hate to cut this off because it's been a great conversation and I want to talk to you about this all day and hear lots more questions and ideas from people. But we're over time, so I'm going to let you go. Elaine, thank you so much. And folks have been, giving the applause in the chat box already, but just want you to, feel that and see that virtual applause for you. It was a great session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to be with you all. Yeah, you're doing great work, and I'm a big fan of Inchi Child, and Fawn knows where to find me if anybody needs to connect with me one-on-one to, ask another question or tell me I was wrong about something or whatever it is. It's great to spend some time with all of you. Okay.
Take care, everybody. Bye.